All right, so today we are kicking off a brand new message series that's going to take us up to Christmas called Hope for the Holidays. Here's why we're doing this series, because for me, I don't know how it works for you. I have a lot of fond memories around Christmas and around this entire season. I have like all the warm fuzzies about, all the gifts I used to get and the way we used to interact and hang out with our families. But for many of us, when you think about the holidays, it might be a mixed bag, right? Like you might have some great memories and feel really good about it. And then you might have some parts of it where you go, you know what? Every year at the holidays, it brings up these old feelings. Every year at the holidays, it presents us with these challenges, and it reminds us of where we lack and where things are different, or where we're hurting, or people that used to be with us, people that used to be around us. And so the holidays, for some of us, is great, but for many people, here's what we know. It is not the most wonderful time of the year. It is for many the most depressing time of the year. And so for us, here's what we want to do. We want to take this series, 4 weeks, and we want to look at 4 different things that we can confront, that we can get some hope through. And so next week, we're going to talk about our need for control, right? During the holidays, when it seems like you can't do anything right and all these bad things come up, we tend to want to control things. And so we're going to talk about that. In a few weeks, we're going to talk about our need for approval. Because, right, you get around some family you haven't been around in a year, especially if you got like that uncle or that cousin and you just wish they would like you, right? We're going to talk about your need for approval. Today, we're going to kick off with something that I think is really important, and we're going to talk about our feelings of inadequacy. Our feelings of inadequacy. And so you've got a note sheet there that was on your chair when you came in. Man, I would suggest taking notes. I think this is really good. If you're somebody who you're not like the line-by-line person, you can flip it over, take notes on the back, take notes in the margin, wherever you want to go. But we're going to talk about the feelings we have of inadequacy, and we're going to learn some truths that God would share with us about those feelings that we interact with, all right? So I would like to, if you will, just join me in prayer for just a moment, and I'm going to pray just that God would open our hearts and minds to hear his truth and then to walk out of here different, all right? Jesus, we thank you so much for how great you've been to us. God, we know this time of year truly is, it's a mixture for people. God, there are some great memories, some fond memories, and then there are some emotions, some feelings that come up that are incredibly difficult for us. And so, God, I pray that today as we talk about these feelings of inadequacy, that you would remind us just how adequate you are. That you would remind us of all the ways you've taken care of us and of what you've given us to live this life, and how you're going to help us and empower us to live this life in an even better way than maybe we thought was possible. Jesus, we love you, we thank you, and it's in your name we pray. Amen. So how many of you guys like buy presents for everybody? Like you just feel like you could spend an entire year's salary on presents, right? Some people are pointing towards their spouses. Maybe not the best idea, but could be true. Our family has like slowly gotten bigger year by year. And so a couple years ago, my wife's side of the family had this idea that they thought was great, and I hated. Their idea was we will do homemade presents. Now, here's why I hate that. I'm not like a creative guy, okay? Like I can like take something that somebody's done and change it a little bit, or maybe come up with something that's sort of like somebody else. My wife's side of the family though, she's got one brother who's a professional artist, another guy who is educated way beyond his means and is super creative and just sees things differently. Her dad made a homemade fishing rod, okay? Her mom handmade a quilt. Her cousin, her brother, did like these glass figurines or something like that. Just some figurines. I mean, crazy things like that. Katie baked all her cookies and all this stuff that everybody loves, and people were fighting over those the whole time. So I had to sit there and think, okay, as a non-creative guy, what am I going to make? What am I going to bring to this thing that's going to be like any good? And so I thought, here's what I can do. I love to grill and I love to try stuff, and so I will make, because I've made it before and it was a really big hit, I'll make my own barbecue sauce and I can give that away there at this party. And I thought maybe, just maybe, this will be a hit. Do you ever give somebody something and it's clear within like the first 2 seconds that they hate what you gave them, right? So one of her family members, I won't say his name, I'll just say that it starts with P and ends with at. He gets this, he goes, I'll try this one. He opens it up and he goes, barbecue sauce? Who brought barbecue sauce? Like, who wants barbecue? Because in his mind, here's what he thinks. He thinks that somebody's going to like gift him a car in that moment. And he's like, oh, well, this is just barbecue sauce. And so I spent the whole night getting junk about it just being barbecue sauce. And then what makes it even worse is, you know how some people, like, they're the conscientious people. Maybe this is you. I think this is probably like Nikki's type of personality here, where like somebody feels bad about it. And so people kept coming up to me and like, you know what, barbecue sauce was really a good idea. Like, that's a great idea. Like, I don't know why he reacted react like this is really solid. And I'm sitting there going like, shut up, right? I know what you're trying to do here. Don't try to make me feel better, right? Like in that moment, I'm sitting there as a guy who's not artsy, not creative, but I poured my heart and soul into something and I felt completely less than. I felt completely inadequate. And here's the thing, they're family, I can roll with it. It ain't making me miss any sleep, but I felt that entire day inadequate about the gift. And in fact, like still, when I think about that, like you know how you get those feelings of like that feeling in the pit of your stomach, like you messed up? That's how I feel almost every time I think about my homemade barbecue sauce, especially when I look at the homemade quilt that I have from my mother-in-law, right? For us, here's the thing, like that's just a funny example, but some of us walk around feeling less than and we can feel inadequate. In fact, the holidays can really churn those feelings up. And so on your note sheet, here's what we got. We got 4 reasons why we feel inadequate. But before we do that, I just want to give you a quick preview of what we need to remember when it comes to understanding our feelings of inadequacy. So here's the truth we're going to unpack before we get into why we feel inadequate. Okay, the truth is this. Where I feel inadequate, Christ is more than adequate. Where I feel inadequate, Christ is more than adequate. And so here's what we're going to do. We're going to look at our feelings of inadequacy, but we're going to compare those with God's truth, all right? So here's our feelings of inadequacy. Here's why we feel inadequate. And if you're somebody who likes how things can work together, you're going to notice all of these start with the letter U, and so you're going to love that, right? Here's the first one. Why do we feel inadequate? First reason is this: unfair criticism. Unfair criticism. Like, have you ever just felt completely unfairly criticized? Like, you stand up next to somebody who's done the same thing as you, and it's like they get all the bells and whistles, and you get just dogged on, right? You've gotten unfairly criticized. Maybe somebody's told you before that you're not good enough, or that you'll never be good enough. Maybe every single time you were criticized, like they would look at your paper and you make one mistake and you just couldn't get past it because they wouldn't let you get past it, right? Some of us, we feel inadequate because all through our lives at different points and different times, we've been unfairly criticized, right? Second reason is this: it's unrealistic expectations. This is one that I think we really deal with now, and I'm not, hear me, I'm not trying to dog on it, okay? I've got my own feelings on this, but for the generation right beneath mine, many people grew up getting a trophy for everything, right? So if you simply showed up half the time, you got the same reward as somebody who worked their butt off and won the championship, right? Because we have to make sure that everybody feels the same. But what happens is, it gives people this expectation that everything they do is great. And so then you get out in the real world and understand that, you know what? Oh my gosh, I can't believe my boss fired me. I only showed up to work 8 minutes late every day. And yeah, I left a few minutes early, but like, man, I showed up and I worked hard while I was there, right? So you have these expectations that the world's just going to work out a certain way. Or maybe on the opposite side, because this is something I deal with all the time. You get people who, they give you like a compliment that's not really a compliment because it's something they say to everybody. Like, oh my gosh, you are the best. Like, you're the best ever. Like, you could do anything, and like, you feel great about yourself for a second until you see them talk to the next person and go, oh my gosh, you're the best, and you can do anything you set your mind to. And you're thinking, well, if that's true for them, and that can't be true for all of us. Like, we give these unrealistic expectations that everybody's going to either be treated the same way or that everything they touch is going to turn to gold. And we've all lived long enough to know that's not true, right? Third reason is this: unforgiven failures. Unforgiven failures. In other words, you've tried before. Like, you've put effort into something. You've prayed about it. You've given it your absolute best shot, and yet time after time, it just seems like it didn't work out. And so now, when you feel like trying something, you already feel inadequate because you've already messed up before. You've already failed. We've got unforgiven failures in our past. And the last one's this, is unwise comparisons. Unwise comparisons, right? Think about it like this. There's a pastor who said, like, the problem with social media is we compare our behind the scenes to somebody else's highlight reel. Right, so even at something like Thanksgiving or Christmas, you look at what everybody else is doing and how everybody else is feeling, and you go, oh my gosh, like, my Christmas just wasn't that exciting. My life isn't as cool as theirs, right? We get these comparisons that just truly aren't wise. And here's another way they play out this time of year, is you're going to see people who the last time you saw them, a lot's changed in their life since then, right? Like, maybe they got married in the past year. You didn't get married. Maybe they had a kid. You didn't have a kid. Maybe they got a promotion at their job and you're tired of your job, right? So all we do is we see what other people have and what's changed for them, and we compare it to ourselves, and we feel less than. We feel inadequate. But once again, here's the truth we're going to explore for a little while, is that where I feel inadequate, Christ is more than adequate, right? So in other words, the answer we need, the hope we need for the holidays right now when it comes to our feelings of inadequacy is not simply just telling ourselves to get over it. It's not simply telling us that we just need to avoid certain people. Our hope for the holidays is Christ himself, to say, okay, the more I can focus on him, the better chance I have to properly deal with these feelings of inadequacy. In the Old Testament, there's this guy named Gideon. And Gideon's story is he becomes a judge for the nation of Israel. A judge is just somebody who God used to lead his people, to help them get to the next step. He would take them out of bondage under the leadership of a judge, and then he would bless them under this judge. But then unfortunately what happened was the judge would die, and God's people would start turning away from God again. And so Gideon is one in this line of judges, and in Judges 6 we get kind of his origin story. Okay, if you're a fan of like comic books or the Marvel movies or anything like that, usually the first movie in a series, they go through the character's origin, right? That you get to meet him or her where they are, and you get to see kind of the potential of where things are heading. This is Judges chapter 6 for Gideon. Gideon has his origin story in these few verses we're going to read. So Judges chapter 6 is where we're going to be. It's on your note sheet there, starting in verse 11. It says this, then the angel of the Lord came and sat beneath a great tree at Ophrah, which belonged to Joash of the clan of Abiezer. Gideon, son of Joash, was threshing wheat at the bottom of a winepress to hide the grain from the Midianites. Here's why that's so important, is normally when you would thresh wheat, you would want to do it out in the open so that when you threw it up in the air, things would begin to separate and you could get rid of some of the unwanted things so that your wheat would be better. When you do it down in a winepress because you're hiding, your wheat is always going to be impure at best. It's just not a good version. But the reason he's doing it that way is because at this point in time, God's people were under bondage. The Midianites, this clan, they would come by place to place, and wherever they found an Israelite who seemed like they had their stuff together, they would plunder and take everything from them, even up to their lives. They might kill them just to get what they wanted. They wanted their property. They wanted their prosperity. And so Gideon, all he can do is think, I don't care if my meal isn't as good as it could be. I don't want to lose everything I have. So he's hiding. He's threshing wheat inside this winepress. Then in verse 12, all of a sudden everything changes, right? This is where we go from like Gideon's everyday and his normal to all of a sudden something drastically becomes different in his story. It says, then the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, mighty hero, the Lord is with you. So you got this guy who's hiding, who's now being told he's a hero by an angel that just appears as if from nowhere. Sir, Gideon replied in verse 13, if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? And where are all the miracles our ancestors told us about? Didn't they say the Lord brought us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and handed us over to the Midianites. Let me tell you, there are going to be some times in your life, no matter how much you love Jesus, no matter how long you've been in church, where you are going to feel like not only is life not going your way, but it's going to feel like God himself is sometimes working against you. Now, I'm not saying that's true. I'm just saying there are going to be times where you pray prayers and they go unanswered for a while. It's going to frustrate you. There are going to be times where you wish things were different and you're going to cry out to God and you're going to do everything you know to do, and yet it's going to seem as if nothing is changing, and you are going to feel like, okay, God, if you are with me like you promised to be, why is all this happening to me? Why aren't things working out the way I hope they would? Why can't things just even be steady and normal? Why do they always have to seem like they're going bad and going against me? These are the very real feelings that Gideon is feeling. He's saying, why has all this happened to us? Where are you? If you're with us, why are all these things happening? Like our ancestors, they say they interacted with you. We have yet to see your power. Then the Lord turned to him and said, go with the strength you have and rescue Israel from the Midianites. I am sending you. He doesn't necessarily address Gideon's problem with him. He simply tells him the next step. See, for many of us, here's a little thing we're going to have to work through, is that we want to spend a lot of our time questioning God, and that's okay. God's a big God. He can handle it. But sometimes the way forward is actually moving forward. It's not just sitting around and having a pity party. It's not just sitting around and feeling bad for yourself. Sometimes it's literally just going, okay, God, what have you told me to do? I'm just going to do it. He says, go in the strength you have and rescue Israel from the Midianites. I am sending you. But Lord, Gideon replied, how can I rescue Israel? My clan is the weakest in the whole tribe of Manasseh, and I am the least in my entire family. Does that sound like somebody who feels inadequate? He says, my clan is the weakest, and my family is the weakest in that clan. In other words, like my family, me, myself, I am a part of the weakest of the weak. Gideon feels inadequate. But then the Lord said in verse 16, I will be with you, and you will destroy the Midianites as if you were fighting against one man. I think what's incredibly important here is we have a man, Gideon, who feels inadequate. He's living his life in fear, and yet God doesn't run away from that inadequacy, but he meets him right where he is, and he speaks to him through that inadequacy. And so here's what we want to do. Real quick, we want to talk about 3 things that we learn about God through Gideon's inadequacy. 3 ways that we can deal with the inadequacy. And so here's the first thing on your note sheet there. First truth we're going to wrestle with here is that God sees more in you than you see in yourself. God sees more in you than you see in yourself. You are your biggest enemy. Did you ever think about that? Like, nobody is going to be against you as much as you are. Nobody is as aware of your failures as you are. Nobody knows the bad things that you think as much as you do. But in spite of that, no matter how you feel about yourself, God sees more in you than you see in yourself. God sees more in you than you see in yourself. He has better feelings about you than you have about yourself. He has better thoughts about you than you have about yourself. God sees more in you than you see in yourself. In fact, verse 12 there, one of the first things we see is the angel of the Lord appears, and the first thing he calls him is a mighty hero. Some translations say a mighty warrior, and yet here's what we know from Gideon's story. There's nothing heroic about what Gideon is doing in that moment. There's nothing that's like a warrior when you're hiding, trying to make sure you don't have a fight. God says you're a mighty hero. Gideon honestly probably feels like a pretty big wimp. Probably doesn't feel like he is what God is saying he is. He probably feels less than and inadequate. You say I'm a mighty hero, but if I'm such a mighty hero, why are we going through this? And why am I dealing with this? Can I tell you that your current situation is not the greatest indicator of God's love for you? And your current situation is not the greatest indicator of how God feels about you and how God sees you. God sees more in you than you see in yourself. God is in the business of finding us where we are and taking us to a new place. God's in the business of finding us where we are, how we feel about ourselves in that moment, and giving us hope for the future, saying, hey, I've got something different planned for you, and I've got something better for your future than you might feel right now. Because here's how life works. Life will consume us. Right now, in the moment you are, this is how you think your life is going to always be. But talk to me in 2018, and let's see how much in your life has changed. My life in 2016 is 100% different. Well, I'm still married to the same woman. So it's 95% different than it was in 2012. Right? My life couldn't be different, but life has this way of making you feel like how things are now are how they will always be, and it causes you to start changing the way you see yourself. Life has a way of causing you to feel less than and feel stuck. God shows up to a guy who feels inadequate and feels stuck and says, you're a mighty hero, because God sees more in you than you see in yourself. So here's what I love. I was trying to think, okay, well, God, if you see more in us than we see in ourselves, well, then how do you see us? Like, how does God, when God sees you and he sees me, what does he think? And it took me to one of my favorite verses in all the Bible, Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10. First sermon, one of the first sermons I ever preached. I had to preach this in a classroom setting. Talk about awkward, right? You have all your peers just criticizing your every word. But these are the verses I was given. And here's what Paul writes when it comes to God's relationship with us. He says this. He says, for we are God's masterpiece. We are God's masterpiece. When I think of the word masterpiece, one of the first things that comes to mind is the Sistine Chapel that Michelangelo would paint the ceiling, right? This was 4 years of his life of intricate planning, laying everything out, just doing the groundwork there. Before he ever put a brush on the ceiling, he had to do a ton of work just to get prepared to know, here's what every single inch of the ceiling is going to look like. And then he painted it, and he would go through all the trouble of each brush stroke, making sure it was exactly how he wanted it. He would have to go back and fix things when they wouldn't work out the way he hoped. Over 4 years, how many of you guys know a ceiling even changes? And so he'd have to adjust on the fly when things in that room, in that chapel would change. And yet after 4 years, here's what we know. This is his life's work. This is what he's probably mostly known for hundreds of years later. He's been dead and gone, and yet we still look at that and go, that is the masterpiece, the life's work, the workmanship of Michelangelo. See, when Paul writes that we're God's masterpiece, here's what that means, is that we are living testimonies to the goodness and greatness of God. We are the ones that walk around, and that's how God goes, here's how much I love you. Look at that one. Look at all the ways that I make their body work so intricately within itself. Look at all the things I do that they don't even see that make this life work out the way that it should. We are God's masterpiece. And Paul continues with this. He says, he created us anew in Christ Jesus so we can do the good things he planned for us long ago. So notice, God's plan for your life is not bad, it's good. He planned good things for you and for me long ago. And so where you and I might feel stuck, God sees the future as being bright for us. He's the one that created us. He's the one that planned it out. And so he's got good plans for his people. God sees more in you than you see in yourself. In fact, a quick view of Scripture is going to show you that time and time again. There's a lady in Joshua named Rahab. When we meet her, she's a prostitute. But one of the last times the Bible writes about her is her name is mentioned in the lineage of Jesus Christ. We get a guy like David. His dad doesn't even think about him when Samuel comes calling and looking for a king, and yet God chose David to be a man after God's own heart. God chose David to lead his people. He was the least likely to be chosen, and yet God chose him because God sees him differently than even he saw himself. And then you get a guy named Peter. We're going to read one of his verses here in just a few minutes. But Peter's a guy who would deny Jesus 3 times, and yet on the day of Pentecost, just a few weeks after denying Christ, Peter is used to preach by God and see thousands of people decide to follow Jesus on the day of Pentecost. God sees more in you than you see in yourself. All right? Second truth, second thing we have to wrestle with is this, is that God has given you more than you think. God has given you more than you think. So Gideon, his first response to God, when God says, you're a mighty hero, I want you to go and save my people from the Midianites, I am sending you. Gideon's first answer is, I don't see how that's going to work. Like, that's just not working for me, God. Like, I don't think you know what you're doing. Maybe you need to go a house down. You got the wrong guy. Like, this just isn't my deal. And yet God's response to him is very simple. He says this. He says, go in the strength you have. Go in the strength you have. In other words, God's provision and God's strength for Gideon was not something that was going to come later. It's something that he already had right then and right there. God had given him more than he realized. He had given him more than he thought. And the same thing is true for you and for me. God has given us more than we think. Man, one of the greatest things that the enemy, that Satan wants to do in your life is he wants you to not just feel inadequate, he wants you to live as being inadequate. He wants you to feel like when somebody throws an opportunity your way that you could never possibly do that. You won't even consider it because you know deep down inside you're not good enough. You will never take the risk because you know what? Nobody could ever do that. That's going to be for somebody who's better than me, somebody who's maybe a little more personable than me, maybe a little more outgoing than me. I can't do that. That's for somebody else. And yet God is going to say to us, just like he says to Gideon, if I've called you to do it, I want you to move forward simply in the strength you already have. I want you to go with what I've already given you. You have everything you need right now to do what God's asking you to do. No matter how big and scary that ask of God is, God has given you everything you need to do it. Now, does that mean that you're not going to have to develop the skill? Absolutely not. Does that mean you're not going to try and mess up and try and fail? Absolutely not. That just tells me this, that if God's called you to do it, he's going to give you what you need to actually accomplish what he's asking. God has given you more than you think. In fact, Peter wrote this in 2 Peter 1:3. He says, by his divine power, God has given us everything we need. God has given us everything we need for living a godly life. Notice, Peter doesn't say God's given us most of everything we need. God's taking care of 90% of it. No, he says that God's given us everything we need for living a godly life. And this, once again, is coming from the mouth of somebody who failed big time on the big stage. God has given us everything we need for living a godly life. So here's what I'm going to ask of you. The next time that you feel like God's calling you to do something, or the next time you see a need and you feel like, hey, maybe I could serve there because, you know what, somebody needs to do it, and maybe I could step in and maybe I could make a difference. When you feel that feeling that tells you, nah, that's for somebody else, you couldn't possibly make that happen. Man, can you recognize that voice for what it is? That's not the voice of God. That's the voice of the enemy in your life. You can take the risk. You can step up. God's given you more than you think. He's given you everything you need for living a godly life. And then here's the last point I got for you this morning that we see from Gideon's story, is that it's not really about you. It's not really about you. Whatever it is, it's not really about you. Whatever God's asking you to do, it's not really about you. See, we tend to think that the decisions we make are about us and they're isolated to us, but here's what I'll tell you. Every decision we make ripples through eternity. Every decision we make ripples through eternity. The choices you make now and how you parent your kids, that has an effect that's longer than your life. The choices you make now when it comes to how you earn your income has an effect on you and everyone around you. The choices you make with who you date and how you date affects the people you love. The choices you make with how you proceed in your marriage or proceed in your schooling or proceed at your place of work, those have a ripple effect that you can't even fully understand right now. Every decision we make ripples through eternity. It goes far, much further than we ever give it credit for. So here's the cool thing though. It's not really about you. Gideon, time after time, when God tells him what he wants him to do, he keeps saying, I can't do it, I can't do it, I can't do it. And then notice how God responds in verse 16. He says, the Lord said to him, I will be with you. He doesn't say, Gideon, like, you know what? I'm going to make you stronger all of a sudden. You feel weak, that's okay, I'll make you strong. He doesn't say, I'm going to get you over every single one of your doubts. His simple assurance for Gideon is, I will be with you. In other words, he's inviting Gideon to live life with him. Not simply for him, not serving him in a posture of, God, I've got to do this for you. He's saying, I want to do this thing with you. I want to live this life with you. It's not really about you, Gideon. It's going to be about me. In fact, next week we're going to look a little bit more at Gideon's story, and we're going to see just how much it's about God. But he says, I will be with you. It's not really about you. It's not really about me. When I first felt called to be a pastor, I didn't want to do it. I was scared to death. I was really self-conscious. Didn't like being in front of people. And that didn't change even after I got out of Bible school. One of my first times ever preaching at my previous church, I'd been preaching at that point for 4 or 5 years, off and on. And I remember I was standing up in the front, and we were worshiping before the service was, before I was getting up to preach. And all I could think to myself was, because I was so nervous, and I felt so inadequate and felt like I was just going to fail miserably, as I just thought, if I could go to the bathroom right now and make myself throw up, somebody else would have to preach. And I thought to myself, how can I actually do that? Like, I was considering, like, can I leave the front row, sneak out the back, go to the bathroom and puke my guts out simply so I don't have to do this? Because surely somebody else should be preaching this morning and not me. And I remember that morning I prayed this prayer, and I've prayed it almost every single Sunday since, and I pray it even before meetings I go into now. This has been years and years now of praying this same prayer, and it's a prayer I want to encourage you with, is this. I say, God, this is about you and not me. God, this is about you and not me. So many times, even now on a Sunday, here's what I do. I stand over on the side, I worship, I've got my hands raised, and as I know it's getting ready to be my turn, I will begin to say to myself and pray to God, God, this is about you and not me. Sometimes I say it once and I feel good. Sometimes I have to say it time after time, and it takes me a while before it feels good. I say, God, this is about you and not me. God, this is about you and not me. God, this is about you and not me. But eventually, guess what? As many times as I want to pray it, at some point it's my turn, right? And so at some point that prayer goes from, God, this is about you and not me, to, okay, God, this is about you and not me. And I have to begin walking towards what's next for me. I have to lean into it. I have to actually step into God's call for my life. And so for us, here's how it works. We can pray that prayer all the time, and I would encourage you to, but at some point, we've got to learn how to lean into God's call in our life to say, okay, God, help me remember the entire way that this is about you and not me. It's my job, though, at some point, just to take a step forward and keep moving forward and keep moving towards God's call in my life. I can't stand still. I've actually got to step into it. God, this is about you and not me. And here's a great verse you can remember. In fact, if you're a football fan, you've seen this a million different times, but probably taken out of context. Philippians 4:13 says this, for I can do everything through Christ who gives me strength. I can do everything through Christ who gives me strength. I can live this life as if it's about him and not me. Not because I'm great and I'm strong, but because Jesus is great and he's strong. Where I feel inadequate, Christ is more than adequate. My life has to become less about me and more about him. And so this season, man, if you're struggling with inadequacy or feeling like you just can't do it, whatever it is, just remember, God, it's about you and not me. Our job is to step into God's call in our life and simply move forward with what he's asking us to do. Will you guys stand with me?